Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nā mi nui ki a koutou katoa, ko Simon Holdaway aho. Warmest greetings to you all. I'm Professor Simon Holdaway, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Education at Waipapa Taumata Rau. And it's my privilege to introduce my colleague and our new professor, Barry Milne. Barry is a professor in the School of Social Sciences and director of the Centre of Methods and Policy Application in the Social Sciences Campus in the Faculty of Arts and Education. As a quantitative social scientist, his research focuses on analysing data to understand health and well-being across the human life course. His areas of expertise include microsimulation, administrative data, longitudinal studies, socioeconomic and ethnic inequalities, and child development. Barry began his research career working for the Dunedin Multidisciplinary Study from 1998 to 2003, and he then worked at the Institute of Psychiatry at King's College London from 2004 to 2008, and where he obtained his PhD in 2009. Returning to New Zealand, yay! He worked for the Growing Up in New Zealand study from 2008 to 2010 before joining Compass Research Centre in 2010 and becoming its director in 2017. Barry is a scholar who brings numbers to life, so important in social sciences. As director of Compass, he has led pioneering research using longitudinal and administrative data to uncover the hidden patterns behind mental health inequality and social outcomes. His work epitomises research impact and also transdisciplinarity. It informs policy, challenges the assumptions held by government and the general public, and ultimately helps build a better society. As you commented, Barry, while you're a member of the Royal Society panel considering fair futures, New Zealand society isn't as equal as many people think it is, and your work helps challenge people's opinions. It's not about telling people the type of society that is best, but to challenge the beliefs about what New Zealand society is like. What sets Barry apart is his ability to bridge rigorous quantitative methods with deeply human questions. How do early life experiences shape adult well-being? What can data tell us about the lives behind the statistics? And how can we use the knowledge to make better decisions for future generations? Tonight, we'll hear Barry present his Professorial Inaugural Lecture, Explorations in Data, Developing a Social Research Career Through Serendipity and Curiosity.
Kia ora, Simon. Tēnā tātou katoa, no koutarana me ingarangi oku tupuna, e whanau mai aho, e Waihopai, e tipu ake aho e reira. E raro e te monga o Hananui, e te taha o ngā wai o Waihopai. Kei Awaraka aho e noho ana, e raro e te monga o Waraka, e te taha o ngā wai o Te Aonga. Nō reira, a ngā tangata whenua o tēnā wāhi, tēnā koutou. Ko Barry Milne aho, he manataki aho ki Compass Research Centre, he aharangi aho ki Waipapa Taumata Rau. Thank you. So, yes, serendipity and curiosity. More serendipity, I think. So I'll take you through my journey of how I've got to stand here today. And it's fair to say that not much of it has been planned. I don't know how many, I know some of you know what this is, but I don't know how many of you know what this is. What I'm showing you there is a Morris water maze. That little black spludge at the bottom is a rat. That rat is swimming in that water maze trying to find a platform. The platform they can't see, although you can see where it is here. And you make the water opaque so they don't know where the platform is, but they have to use cues around them to find where it is. I was doing that work when my life changed, I think it's fair to say. So I was working in the lab of Neil McNaughton. I went to him with this crazy idea, and it was crazy and it didn't work, that maybe rats can use the shape cues of a water maze to find out where the platform was. So in other words, you leave half of it as a circle and you sort of change the other half of it so it's more like an ellipse. And can they use that? And the answer was no. In that lab with me at the time was Neil McNaughton, who's now a professor of psychology here at the University of Auckland. Marianne Senior, Marianne Woodnorth now, who is now research manager at Te Tauka Tubai, the Auckland DHB. And Karen Waldy, who wasn't so much in the lab, but she hung around the lab a lot because she's married to Ian. But she was working on another lab, actually. This is at University of Otago, I should say, at another lab at the University of Otago. Anyway, so I was getting towards the end of doing this work here, and Marianne said to me, hey, I see that there are opening for jobs being interviewers on the Dunedin study. I'm going to apply. Do you want to? And I thought to myself, why the hell would I want to do that? I'm not interested in humans in the slightest. I was interested in spatial behaviour in rats, and that's what I've been reading about for the last year, and was thinking that I might develop a career in understanding the neurobiology of spatial awareness, essentially. Anyway, at some point, the conversation kept going on, and Neil joined in, and he said something along the lines of, if you've got two sticks to rub together up there, you'll go for the job. So I did apply for the job, and I was offered an interview. So I went for my interview at the Dunedin study, and I was sitting there waiting for my interview, and as I was sitting there waiting for my interview, I saw this person walk out. That's Moana Theodore, who I know a lot better now, but I knew a little bit back then. And my first thought was, man, she's dressed a lot better than me. And she still does. And then I walked into the interview, and in the interview were Richie Porton, who at that stage was the deputy director of the Dunedin study, Phil Silver, the director of the Dunedin study, and Michelle McCann, who was administrator for the Dunedin study, had been there a long time. Phil passed away 2 months ago, and Richie passed away a couple of years ago now. Anyway, so they started interviewing me, and they were more interested in kind of my research potential, I suppose it's fair to say, and not in the fact that I was actually interviewing for an interviewer job. In fact, they said, you know, if it was just down to interviewing skills, Barry, you wouldn't get the job because there's lots of other people who are a lot better than you at this. But we can see something that you might be able to, develop into a researcher. And I thought, okay. So went away, having completed the interview, and then whatever it was, a week or something later, they got back to me and said, yes, you've got the job. And Marianne didn't get the job. But anyway, so at that point, my life changed. My research life and career changed. I became, at that point, that sort of set me on the path to investigating drivers of health and well-being across the life course in humans rather than spatial behaviour in rats. But this is partway through the story. I'll tell you how it all began. This is Invercargill in about 1971, 1972. I was born in 1971 in Invercargill. That's pictures of me in both photos there with my elder sister Annie. The fact that she's wearing a T-shirt suggests it's in the summer there in Invercargill, because there's probably only a couple of weeks when it's actually warm enough to wear a T-shirt. On the right there, that picture was taken on my first birthday. It snowed on my first birthday. So, yes, born in Invercargill. That's the hospital I was born in. That photo was taken, I don't know when, but a long time before I was born. It looks like, I don't know, 1920s, 1930s. You can see the unsealed road outside there, but a fantastic building. That's the D Street Maternity Hospital, one of the wings of the D Street Maternity Hospital. I never remember that building. It was, they closed the maternity hospital, and this is where most of the children in Invercargill were born for, I don't know how long, 60, 70 years. But they closed that maternity hospital a few years after I was born and knocked that building down. On that spot now is a McDonald's restaurant. So you can see that they've kept the lovely kind of fencing and gate there, but took down the building and put up McDonald's restaurant. So, like many others, I can claim that I was born at McDonald's. So a few years after I was born, our family was complete. That's my full family there. This was taken, I think, 1973. Mum, dad, 6 children, 3 boys, 3 girls. It was not lost on us that we were very similar to another famous family in the 1970s, the Brady Bunch, who also had a mum and dad and 3 boys and 3 girls. And like the Brady Bunch, we kind of paired off with the older siblings as a pair, and then the middle siblings, and then the younger siblings. Oh, in case you didn't know, this is Big here, sitting in my father's lap. I mean, we weren't like the Bradys in other respects. The dad wasn't an architect, and we didn't have AstroTurf for lawn and various other bits and pieces. But I certainly remember discussions of how we were like the Brady Bunch when I was growing up. Another interesting aspect of my family is, in many respects, we represent the peak of the baby boom. So what I'm showing you there, overlaid on top of a picture of my family, is a graph showing the number of births in New Zealand over time, over the last 70 years from 1952 to 2024. And you can see it's remained remarkably consistent at around 60,000 births, give or take. And actually the peak was in this period here, when myself and my siblings were born. So my eldest sibling, Annie there, she was born in 1958. My brother Pete at the back, who was born in 1960. My brother Al in 1962. My sister Sue in 1963. 1961, 1962 and 1963 were the 3 years that have the most births in New Zealand. There's been no greater number of births since. The population of New Zealand at this point was around 2 million. It's over 5 million now. Yet, the number of births has not increased. And a demographer might tell you, well, you can see kind of the baby boom here, and then an echo of the baby boom is the early baby boomers are having children, and then the second echo of the baby boom as they're having grandchildren, etc. At that point there, 4 children in the family, which at that stage was not that big a family there. It was at the upper end, but people had 3 or 4 children in the family. And at that point as well, my mother was looking after 4 children under the age of 5 at some point. And I asked my brother, how the hell did my mother manage looking after 4 children under the age of 5? He just looked at me and said, she coped, which I think women did back then. I was next born in 1971. That's the 4th most popular year for births. Again, no year since has had more births than that, and my sister finishing the family in 1973. We entered the colour era in 1981, so that's us again. You can see we still go off in pairs there in terms of older children, middle children, like the Bradys, and the younger children. And we're still a close family. This picture here was taken last year at my niece's wedding in Perth. Younger children, middle children, older children, just like the Brady Bunch. So I grew up in Invercargill. I spent my whole schooling years in Invercargill. Going through school, I did fairly well. I was kind of known as one of the guys that was relatively good in maths. But by getting towards the end of my schooling years, I wanted something different, and I did Latin at school. I did stayed through English through the final year and did history as well. And when I decided to enter university, I suppose another thing to say here is this generation was kind of the first generation that really went to university in great numbers. New Zealand, 5 of these 6 siblings went to university. I went to university, and I decided I wasn't going to do maths. What I did, I'll do, in those days at the University of Otago, maybe other universities, they didn't call things papers. There was kind of units and half units. And a half unit is the equivalent of a paper. Did a unit of philosophy, a unit of psychology, a unit of anthropology, a half unit of statistics, only because you need it for psychology, and a half unit of history. That was when I entered university in 1989. I was useless at anthropology and even worse at history, but I really liked philosophy and psychology. So I carried on with those, majoring in philosophy. Those posters there are the orientation posters from the 4 years I was at university. So I ended up getting a honours degree in philosophy. That's my graduation there. I graduated the next year after that in 1993. And like myself and others in my philosophy cohort class, applied to do PhDs in the States. We basically hunted down places that looked like good places for philosophy, guided by our lecturers there as well, sat the graduate record exam and applied to do a PhD in the United States. While I was waiting to find out whether I got into my PhD in the United States, and I applied for 6 places, I think. I can only remember 5 now. I've forgotten the 6th one. Princeton, Rutgers, University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, Syracuse University and University of Pittsburgh, and one other. I moved to Wellington while I was to work, more or less. I temped there. I was staying with my middle sister, Sue, in Wellington, while I was waiting to find out if I got into this PhD. And they turned me down. So I stayed in Wellington, carried on temping for a while, but decided that I wasn't really liking the life that was heading slightly more towards an office worker, corporate type job, which didn't really interest me. I was aware that I had year 2 psychology, and I thought I can come back and finish a BSc in psychology pretty quickly. Just come back and do 3rd year and a few other papers. So I came back and did 3rd year psychology in Otago, at Otago, also reunited with my friends who were there. And then after doing 3rd year psychology, I realised actually, why would I just do a few more sort of 2nd year or 1st year papers to finish off BSc when actually I could go on and do an MSc? So I did that instead, did the year of papers and then the year of the thesis, which is the Morris Watermays stuff that I was telling you about. And the role in my life that my master's thesis plays at the moment is propping up the monitor of my son's gaming station in his room. So, now we're caught up. I've got the job at the Dunedin study. This is March 1998. So I got the job to be an interviewer at the phase 26, that's when they are age 26, data collection. So that was my main job there, interviewing. I interviewed and did 2 interviews. The way it works still at Dunedin Study, I believe, is you're an interviewer for a particular interview and they rotate round you. You stay in the same room, 4 study members come in on the one day and they rotate round you. So across different days of the week, I interviewed 2 sessions. One was on self-reported delinquency, so sort of illegal behaviour. It also had half of that was personality assessment as well. And the other one was called Update of Life Events, which is people's job and where they're living and that sort of thing. When people from the Dunedin study give talks, they like to show pictures of people doing assessments. Because of confidentiality reasons, they don't take pictures of the study members doing that. So they use the people doing the interviews. So there's pictures of me in one of my favourite shirts at the time, going through the blood pressure assessment, the dental examination and the cardiovascular fitness test where you had to ride on a bike and they measured your heart rate while you were doing it. So as well as that, on my first day, so you did a month training before the interview starts. So we started kind of March the 1st-ish, I think, and the interview started on April the 1st. And the reason they started on April the 1st is that the study members were born from April 72 through to March 73, and they stuck very closely to interviewing as close to their birthday as they could. So the interview started in April, but we trained for a month in March. They took training very seriously. And on one of the first days I was there, I met these 2 people. It's Avshalom Caspi and Temi Moffat. And I think on the first day, Avshalom took me inside and said, as well as doing these interviews, I've got another task for you. And that is, he handed me this book, which is the New Zealand Standard Classification of Occupations, 1995. This isn't the actual book he handed me. This is from the university library. But he said, what I want you to do is code occupations of the study members and also code their social class. So it's sort of old school quantitative sociology. Avshalom, by background, is a sociologist actually, although he's mostly worked in kind of the psychology side of things. And so this here is the L.E. Irving Socioeconomic Index, 1985 version, which is based on data from the 1981 census, where based on the education and income of people in different occupations, they give each occupation a score, from 1 being the highest class occupation to 6 being the lowest class occupation. Because the theory goes that occupation is the means by which you turn education into income. And I was to do that job, and I did it together with Sandhya Ramraka, who was Richie's wife. And I still work closely with Sandhya. So the idea here is I'd go through with the study members and code their occupation, likes of this. So the first 5-digit numbers are numbers you get from this book here. The number in brackets below that is a socioeconomic scale score you get from this here. To my knowledge, they've never really used the occupational coding. It's a means to an end to get to the socioeconomic score. Another interesting thing about my family is that, to some extent, this represents what's called intergenerational mobility, the extent to which you can break free from the socioeconomic class that you grew up in. So I've got my father as a distribution manager, code 4 in the lower half, and my mother doing lots of different things, but as a care worker. And then, as I mentioned before, 5 of us went to university and had various jobs in the upper half of the social class distribution. I am using these types of things to this day. So I didn't know that at that time when I was handed this book, but I'm still using social class coding. And actually, we've got a project with Andrew Spall, Nicole Satherley, and Natalia Bovin looking at intergenerational mobility and the factors that are associated with that. It's not always the case that you get this mobility. And that's just about to start. Okay, so I was an interviewer at the Dunedin study, but not long after that, the biostatistician left, and then how did it work? I think they created 2 roles, more or less, for biostatistical support. One went to Karen Waldy, who I mentioned before, and then I had the other role. So my job there was, as well as being an interviewer, was as a biostatistician. This was the second paper I ever published. The first paper was on use of alternative medicine amongst the study members. This looked at an issue that is still important today. That is, is there a brain drain, one, and if there is the brain drain, what characterises the people who are going overseas and staying there? So we looked at the study members, 230 of which had lived overseas for some point. 202 at the time, actually. We're living overseas at age 26. And we characterised their movements as if they were on OE. That is, they were overseas or had been overseas and either had come back or planned to come back in the next 5 years. Brain drain, when you asked them, they said, we're going to come back in 10 years' time or at retirement or not at all. And those that were uncertain. And interesting thing here, we asked, what are these reasons you moved overseas? And the brain drain group, kind of validating that group to some extent, this was the only difference in the questions we asked. They said they went for better work opportunities, better pay, more jobs, the sort of thing that's being talked about at the moment. And one of the interesting things about that is that the socioeconomic position of the families of those who went overseas and said they weren't coming back was almost identical to those who never left. So it was more a brain exchange than a brain drain, which is one of the points that we made in the paper. Another paper that used these data was this paper that Richie led and Avshalom and I did quite a bit of work on the association between children's experience of socioeconomic disadvantage and adult health. So I remember doing the analysis for this paper. Avshalom was sitting with me in my office while I was doing the analysis, and we were looking at various health outcomes, and I'll show you those health outcomes shortly, and looking at the extent to which childhood socioeconomic status, so their position over the families that they grew up in, their socioeconomic position in the first 15 years of life, and health outcomes. And we found associations, and he said, control now for their socioeconomic status, and it'll go away. The association between childhood socioeconomic status and health would go away. And the reason he said that was that, yes, there's an association between childhood socioeconomic status and later health, but only because children in low socioeconomic status families end up more likely than not in low socioeconomic status in adulthood. So I controlled for adult socioeconomic status, but the association stayed. In fact, that's one of the figures from the paper. And what we've got here is 4 groups: those who were always in high socioeconomic status in childhood and in adulthood, those who were in high, and that's the black bars, those who were in high socioeconomic status in childhood but then dropped to low in adulthood, those who were low in adulthood and raised to high, low in childhood and raised to high in adulthood, that's the sort of dark grey bars, a third from the left, and those who are persistently low. And you can see there, being low in childhood and staying there is worse, is the worst position to be in terms of your health, particularly for dental health. And of all the work that I did in the Dunedin study, the thing that seems most sensitive to socioeconomic positions seems to be dental health for whatever reason. Actually, something that Peter Davis, my then future boss, did his PhD on, I believe. And that was published in Lancet. And I didn't realise it at the time, but I suspect it was actually one of the first illustrations of the importance of socioeconomic status in childhood, taking account of adult socioeconomic status, because you had the data to do so. One thing about the Dunedin study is that it was one of the first to get there, to have really long data and answer some of these questions that others would have liked to have answered. Other thing happened when I was in Dunedin. I met Sonia. Met Sonia through the Dunedin study, actually. So she was the flatmate of the partner of the person who booked the travel at the Dunedin study, because they had to fly. 202 of them lived overseas. They had to fly all of them in. And so we met and we went with a group of people to a movie. The movie, I think, was the second Austin Powers movie. And we became a couple and moved in together. And Sonia worked at various places, including as a chef and also at the Dunedin Casino and at Larnach Castle, but then undertook a degree in botany and finished that degree in botany. So at that point, it must have been just after that point, Sonia, wasn't it, that we decided we were going, and we'd saved a bit of money, we were going to move overseas, so moved to the UK. And one of the reasons we were moving to the UK was that Sonia had a possibility of doing a PhD in botany at Cambridge University. So we were to make our way there to the UK for, I think, May 2004, I think, where she'd meet with people there and see if she got into the PhD. So on the way there, we spent 4 months travelling. We spent 3 months in Thailand and 1 month in India on our way to the UK. And in the UK, we went to Cambridge to see if Sonia got a PhD. Unfortunately, like me with my PhD in philosophy, she did not get... Well, she got a position, but there was no funding for it, and we didn't have the £30,000 to cover her doing a PhD. Tammy Moffat and Avshalom Caspi knew I was heading overseas and said, well, if you're in London, we might have a job for you. Taking a step back now and looking back and being in the position I am now, running a research centre, how the hell they had money available to just say, oh yeah, we can get you a job if you come here, I have no idea. But they did. And this was at the Institute of Psychiatry, as Simon mentioned. And my job there was twofold. It was as data manager for a twin study that they were working on. So most of the people in the middle of this picture are interviewers on the twin study they worked on. So they travelled around the country by train, going to the houses of families with at that stage it was 10-year-old twins, and interviewing them. But also working on something called the Dunedin Family Health History Study. And the Dunedin Family Health History Study got underway while I was still in Dunedin, and the idea there was, and this is a slide I showed when I've been talking about this in the past, is you get the study member and the parents of the study member to report on 3 generations of their family to find out their health. And I was to look after those data while I was working at the Institute of Psychiatry in London. Another interesting aspect here was, this is called a family pedigree, this stuff this on the right-hand side there. And when they filled this out, they went into people's homes and got them to fill this out. They put first names of each of the members in the family pedigree. And they made the decision, this is Temi and Avshalom, that the disclosure risk was too large for a family being identified if the data entry was done in Dunedin, because you'd see a whole pedigree there. And someone was like to think, I know a family with those siblings and those parents. And so they sent all the booklets across to London where they were data entered there. And that's what I was working on. So they were arriving still when I got there, actually. And I had to process these forms. As I was working on this, I realized, hey, I could actually turn this into a PhD, because I can see how there's enough scope there to look at what's going on in the family as it may influence the child, the proband's outcome. And my PhD was on the influence on family history on psychiatric phenotypes, is what I called it, so basically psychiatric disorder. My supervisors were Mike Crutter and Terry Moffat. This was probably the main paper from my PhD. There were 4 papers as part of my PhD. What that shows here is for 4 mental health outcomes: depression, anxiety, alcohol dependence, and drug dependence. This is the self-rated impairment of people with these disorders. So when they interviewed them in the Dunedin study, if they met criteria for a disorder, they say, well, how much does it impact your life? And they could rate that on a 1 to 5 scale. And what this shows is that those with a strong family history are more likely to rate their impairment as being high. And on the right-hand side, those with a strong family history were more likely to have persistent disorder. So this is the number of Dunedin interview waves at which they had depression, anxiety, alcohol, and drug dependence. Which is why the paper is called Predictive Value of Family History on Severity of Illness. It is a predictor of how severe your illness will be. Another paper that was part of my PhD was actually, the paper was led by Candice Odgers, who's now University of California, one of them in Southern California. And what Candice did is she looked at conduct problems over time in the Dunedin study. So this is a self-reported delinquency that I did the interviewing for at age 26, and created trajectories using group-based trajectory modelling, the Nagin version, I think, or the Muthen and Muthen version. And to some extent, this corroborated Timmy Moffat's theory, which was about how there's different types of antisocial behaviour across the life course. Timmy's original theory was there is adolescent-limited life course, adolescent-limited antisocial behaviour, where there's a group of children who act out while they're in adolescence, but they grow out of it and they are fine in adulthood. But there's this life course persistent group who start antisocial behaviour or conduct disorder, conduct problems early and continue that on. Turns out those who are adolescents don't grow out of it so much, and this has been corroborated by other data as well as this paper here. But basically, you've got four groups, much like what I showed you for the socioeconomic paper before, where you've got never were involved in antisocial behaviour, got involved over time, were involved as a child but grew out of it, and then were always involved. And it turns out that family history of externalizing disorders, which are things like conduct problems, substance abuse, alcohol abuse, really separates those groups really nicely. Another paper I'll just highlight that I did while I was over there. So I was working on my PhD, but working in a large research team, you're working on lots of different stuff all the time. And I worked on this paper, which was the extent to which children who were socially isolated children who were isolated in childhood, they tended to be loners, didn't tend to be liked much by other children, whether that impacted their adult health in terms of cardiovascular risk factors, so blood pressure, glycated hemoglobin, obesity, low cardiorespiratory fitness. And it turns out that having isolation in childhood is a strong predictor of having adult cardiovascular risk factors. I'm showing you this one because it comes back into my life later on. Other thing that happened while we were in London is Lewis arrived. So Lewis was born in 2006. There's pictures of him there. My favourite one is us on the tube there. And then we decided I'd finished my PhD. So I finished my PhD July 2008. it must have been, yeah. And we came back I was rushing more or less to finish my PhD. We came back in August 2008. So this is us arriving back in New Zealand. We decided we're moving back in New Zealand, but we didn't care where. So we'll go where the opportunities were. So Sonia got an opportunity to do a PhD here at the University of Auckland, but actually at Plant and Food Research. So this is in botany. And so we moved back to Auckland. Must have been earlier that year that I'd actually met up with Susan Morton from the Growing Up in New Zealand study at a conference in Oxford. And she mentioned that they were getting the study underway and said, well, get in touch if you're coming back. Man, I've been lucky in my life with the sort of how things have happened. And so I worked then at the Growing Up in New Zealand study for a couple of years. Travelled back to the UK to do my Viva, so that's the oral examination. So this is, it went well, as you can see. It was February 2009. Sonia had arranged for this fantastic bottle of champagne that's personalised, Dr. Barry Milne written on it, which was very cool. And then went back and continued working at the Growing Up in New Zealand study, and then got to work one morning, and then this email arrived saying, outcome of Viva. I'm pleased to inform you that you've satisfied the examiners in the examination for the Doctor of Philosophy in Psychiatry. The date of award of your Doctor of Philosophy is the 1st of April, 2009. I thought, great. I've got my PhD on April Fool's Day. Whether by design, I'm not sure, but they waited until just after midday in the UK to send that email. More exciting than that, we got married in 2009 as well. That was December 2009. This is in Devonport, that's Cheltenham Beach there. Devonport, where Dean, Sonia's brother, lived. Louise, who I worked with in the UK, came across as our best woman at the wedding, which was a fantastic day. It was low tide, so you could walk around from the other side of the point, whatever that beach is, where the ceremony was, to the reception. And I decided I wanted to change. I was data manager at Growing Up in New Zealand, wasn't really getting any research opportunities. So they were advertising a job at the Campus Research Centre, which up until that point I didn't know much about. So I went for an interview there. Was interviewed by Jerry, Roy and Peter Davis. Peter Davis, the founding director of Compass. And didn't get the job. But they called me back a couple of months later and said, oh, yeah, turns out we've got a bit more money and we're looking to hire a second person. Would you like the job? And I said, sure, absolutely. So I then started work at the Compass Research Centre. And I found out, and actually in the interview, Peter, I stalked them prior to going on the interview, saw the type of work that they did and saw they were doing this thing called microstimulation. And I asked Peter at the interview, what's microstimulation about? He goes, don't worry about it, it's quite straightforward. And actually it is, to be honest, now that I do it. But once I got to Compass, I realised the three things they kind of do, and the three things I ended up doing, is understanding health well-being through analysis of whole population data. So that's data from a whole system. They analysed census data on the one hand and data from health systems on the other hand, and they may have even, not that I was involved in it, analysed data from ACC as well. I'd never done this before, but I'd known people who had. In fact, Susan Morton had analysed data like that. And microsimulation, which I needed to learn about. And the third thing was understanding opinions and attitudes using surveys. Opinions and attitudes also sort of health and well-being, but I'll focus on the opinions and attitudes. So I've done most in the whole population data area, a fair bit in microsimulation and a little bit in surveys. This was the first paper I worked on in the whole population data area. This was on a project called ECHO, Enhancing Hospital Outcomes, which was an HRC project that Peter had. And I worked on a paper on what are called ambulatory sensitive hospitalisations. Those are them, examples of them there. The idea here is that they're ambulatory sensitive because theoretically, if people received timely and adequate primary care, ambulatory care, they would not go to hospital with these conditions. And that theory is probably slightly wrong. There probably still would be some of these conditions showing up in hospital, even with perfect ambulatory care, but that's the idea. And it's kind of a measure of how well the health system's doing if you don't have very many ambulatory sensitive hospitalisations. So I had a look at those. And also the aspect here too that's kind of interesting is New Zealand's got a slightly weird health system where you have to pay. You don't have to pay to go to the hospital. You don't have to pay to go to the ED, but you do have to pay to go to ambulatory care, which is kind of the first point, which would stop you going to the other things. So there's a disincentive to go there because you can go to hospital for free. And what I show here is admission rates by deprivation quintile, so that's how deprived area you live in, and by ethnicity. And the two things here are, there are differences by both of these factors, ethnicity and deprivation. And particularly for deprivation, it's getting far worse over time. So we analysed data from 2001 to 2009, and it's really fanned out. So whereas in 2001, there wasn't that much difference between the people by deprivation, there's a huge difference in 2009. And I got wind when I was there that Peter created the subsequent socioeconomic scale to the Ellie Irving scales called the New Zealand Socioeconomic Index. And I can't remember exactly if I said, hey, Peter, do you mind if I update this? Or Peter said, hey, Barry, would you mind updating this? But I did. And so worked on the New Zealand Socioeconomic Index based on 2006 data. That's with Alan Lee from Stats, who wrote the code to do the path analysis that you kind of need to work out the optimal weighting of education and income for each occupation. And a student, Brian Bjorn, 2013, and that was with a summer student. She did a fantastic job in 10 weeks producing this socioeconomic scale. It's Katie Fahey, and she's now doing a PhD in Liverpool. She came across for a summer scholarship from the UK. And then not most recently actually, the 2008 Socioeconomic Index, where Natalia worked on that for a PhD and did some other things with it as well, with Nicola, Liza, and Andrew Spall helping out as well. And then over the last summer, Natalia and I had another student work on the 2023 Socioeconomic Index, and one of my tasks over the next month or two, while on RSL, is to write that up into another Socioeconomic Index. Possibly the last one, now that they've cancelled the census. But the main thing I've been working on, the last 9 years now, is the integrated data infrastructure, which is whole population data writ large in New Zealand. So what this is you've got individual level data of people interacting with government sectors. So people going to the hospital, people receiving a benefit, people paying tax, people enrolling for education. The people and communities data here is people filling out a census, people renting and getting a tenancy bond, people being arrested or put in jail. And all these data are linked together at the individual level and made available for search in an anonymised form under strict access conditions. And there's been a few things written about this. It's slightly controversial. I suspect a lot of people have not heard of this before and are surprised that their data essentially has been linked together and used for research. And so there are issues of social license that I and Lara particularly have written about, and data sovereignty and those sorts of things. But it has real value for research. This is a figure from a paper that Stephanie D'Souza, Laura Richmond-Raccord, and Sena Hall-Anderson and I put together, basically saying these type of data, this doesn't represent just the IDI, but data like this, there's data like this, particularly in Scandinavian countries where they've got people who have an ID that follow them through different sectors, are really good at understanding things across the life course, because you've got all stages of the life course covered, and it's longitudinal by design because it's a time-stamped record of people being hospitalised, of people paying tax, of people getting educational qualifications. So the different colours here are the different areas. So you've got education, you've got socioeconomics. You can link it to address records. So neighbourhood influences can be looked at here. And ideally as well, picking up on the sort of work I did for my PhD, you might be able to do intergenerational stuff here because there may be links between parents and children. So we argued that it's really good for developmental research, which is what probably I've spent most of my time using it for. One of the first things we used it for was as part of the Better Start National Science Challenge. These things, the National Science Challenge is finished middle of last year, middle of 2024, I think. There are 11 of them, and they cover different areas of that the powers that be thought were good things to be studying. There were 3 health ones. One was called Better Start, which focused on the first 24 years of life. That's the one that I got involved with. I went to meetings early with Peter, and I think I just hung around the meetings, and so they involved me at some point. But my role there was on the big data team. Did a lot of work of this work with Nicola Shackleton, who was Deputy Director of Compass, as well as various people. So Rick Ordis there with the white shirt, he was the original lead of the big data theme. The rationale of the big data theme was to help out the other themes by answering key questions that they want answered with whole population data. The other themes were healthy weight, resilient teens, and successful learning. Barry Taylor, he was also on the big data theme, and Wayne Cutfield, he was lead of the Better Start Natural Science Challenge. Second half of the Better Start Natural Science Challenge, I took over as the lead of the big data theme from Rick. Anyway, a couple of papers from that Nicola led here. This focuses on preschool obesity. So obesity measured as part of the before school check, which is a preschool screen of pretty much all 4-year-olds in New Zealand. As you know, there is roughly 60,000 4-year-olds in New Zealand because of 60,000 births. Actually, I think it maxes out at about 55,000 here with the numbers who do this screen. And what Nicola showed, this is through to 2015, 2016, but there's been a subsequent paper that's taken it further on, is that obesity is actually decreasing in New Zealand in childhood, in early childhood at least, maybe not later childhood, Boyd, but in early childhood. And one of the interesting things here too is that in other places where there's been an overall decrease in obesity, especially in children, it's affected some groups more than others, but here it seems like every single group of the population is going down in New Zealand. Focus again a bit more on this in a second paper. Nicola said, well, okay, Nicola knows fancy methods really well. This uses what's called a Oaxaca decomposition matrix to work out how much of a difference between two groups can be explained by various factors. So we looked at the extent to which the difference between European children and Māori children could it be explained by the fact that socioeconomic and other factors are different between those two groups. Turns out that explains only 50% of the difference. So the take home here is you cannot throw away measuring ethnicity by just measuring these other factors. Ethnicity still is a really important factor to include, and if you don't include it, you're not serving the population as well as you could do. That was on the healthy weight theme. This was on the resilient teens theme. This was Nick Bowden's PhD. Worked there as well, helped by Cherie Gibb and Jesse Kokaua. Nick did his PhD on autism spectrum disorder in children in New Zealand, and this one particular paper I'm highlighting tested the theory that's common in the kind of media that people with autism spectrum disorder are more likely to commit crime. And what Nick showed there is actually they're less likely to commit crime when you look at when you compare an autism group to a non-autism group. Autism defined using the integrated data infrastructure. They're less likely to be proceeded against by police, less likely to have a court charge, less likely to have a court conviction, less likely, about the same likely to be incarceration, perhaps slightly higher. One of the reasons for that last fact is that when they do commit a crime, they tend to have greater number of charges, and they tend to be more serious offences. So no greater likelihood of committing a crime, but when they do, it tends to be the more serious offences. Another thing we looked at is inequalities. This is work, so Temi Moffat and Absalom Caspi got back in touch with me and said, hey, we hear you're working with the IDI. We've got some interesting ideas that might be able to test with this. And she introduced me to Leah Richmond-Rakurd, and this paper is with her and Steph D'Souza, who's in Compass, and Sienna Holt-Anderson, basically looking at the idea that people who use a lot of services in one area, seeing whether they use a lot of services in another area as well. So this shows people who appear a lot or are on benefits for a long time, commit a lot of crimes, stay in hospital for a long time, have a lot of prescription fills, and have a lot of injuries. That's from ACC claims. And these bars here show the risk ratios, I think it is, between the different sectors. And what it shows essentially is if you're high in one, you tend to be high in the other. And this was building on the idea of the Pareto principle that kind of 20% of the population account for 80% of something, service use or something like that. We use that information to look to see, well, okay, are people who are using a lot of services, are they more at risk of bad outcomes? And a particularly bad outcome is death. And in this case, we focused on deaths of despair, a concept that sort of came out of the United States, partly but not wholly with the opioid crisis. So these are deaths from drug deaths, alcohol deaths, and suicide deaths. And we've kind of paired things off here. The filled in bars are those who are a high user of one of these sectors, and we look at social welfare, hospital nights, and crime across these three kind of pairs of bars here. And the stippled bars are the ones that not. And you can see both in New Zealand and in Denmark, if you are a high user of one of these services, you're more likely to have a subsequent death of despair. Turns out you're more likely to have a subsequent death generally, and a death of despair not greatly more likely. Other interesting thing there, which I found quite staggering as well, is just the greater number of deaths of despair in Denmark versus New Zealand. Actually, not just deaths of despair as well, but deaths in midlife, generally 25 to 64 in Denmark, greater than in New Zealand. And actually, Denmark has lower life expectancy than New Zealand, which I did not know until then. Microsimulation. So the idea there is you create a simulation model that represents the world, and you try and do tests with it. So it's microsimulation because it's simulating plausible data from micro-level units, in this case, people. And you start with a sample of people that's either real or looks like a real sample of people, and what we do is create what's called synthetic data. So that's data that's made up to look like real people, but it has advantages of not having any kind of disclosure risk to it because you can't identify anyone in the data because they're all made up. You apply statistically derived rules to reproduce patterns via a stochastic process, so people have a probability of developing some outcome over time. Let's say it's an injury. An individual, based on their characteristics, may have a 50% chance of developing an injury. In one run of the simulation, they have it, and another run of the simulation, they don't. And you average it across lots of different runs. Creates a virtual world. And what you can do is say, well, what happens if things were to change in the world by altering parameters? The first simulation model I worked on, and this was running when I started at Compass, was called Modelling the Early Life Course, MEL-C, which looked at various outcomes across the first 13 years of life, analysing data from 4 New Zealand longitudinal studies, the Dunedin Christchurch Pacific Island Family Study and the Tiho Nukaroa Best Outcomes for Māori study. And what this is doing here is doing kind of a similar thing to what Nicola did with the Wahaka decomposition, and show, well, okay, what if Māori children had the same kind of socioeconomic characteristics as Māori Pacific children have the same socioeconomic characteristics as the general population? Would we expect to see different trends in conduct disorder in this case? And we do. And similarly for kids in low socioeconomic status, if they had other family factors that were similar to the general population. Next one we worked on was called Knowledge Lab of the Early Life Course. And this created some cool software where you could actually play around with this, and we showed off the software to policymakers. And in the early stages, at least, of when we developed this, it was getting use. It was getting a good bit of use. And so that the idea is you can play around, you can program the simulations you want to run into the software, and then hit go, hit run scenario, and it'll run the scenario for you. And then most recently, for the better start, I mentioned there was the 3 substantive themes: healthy weight, successful learning, and resilient teens. They each had an intervention that they were developing, and we programmed the interventions into this model called the Better Start model. That was developed by Kevin Chang and Eileen Lee, did the software development there. Using the same sort of structure and the same sort of, this is R Shiny, by the way, the same program more or less that we use for the Knowledge Lab model. And then just to briefly touch on surveys. one survey that I got myself involved with is the International Social Survey Program. It's an international survey on different social topics, where the topic changes every year, and it's run across a number of different countries in the world, the countries that are coloured in there. You see good coverage across Europe and Asia and North America, but pretty lousy coverage in South America and Africa and Middle East. Anyway, it runs itself like the UN. So you go along to these meetings and you vote on, like, these are all countries. See those little tags there? They're all countries. And you sit the seat behind your country's tag, and you vote on the topics for the survey, which is an absolutely awful way to design the best survey for one country, but it's actually probably the best way to design a survey that works as best it can for all countries. And it also serves the purpose of being democratic. So that's me there, sitting between Poland and the United States. Other cool thing about that is they run these meetings, they run them in interesting countries. So we went to Mexico and Iceland, and took Sonia and Lewis with me, which was very cool. So because we run these surveys ourselves, we have opportunities to add questions to them. So I was watching the flag debate that was developing in 2015, and I was seeing that all the polls were showing that there was very low support for changing the flag, but everyone they spoke to in the media seemed to want change. And I thought, why is that? Whose views are being represented in the media where the polls are showing something completely different? These surveys generally, particularly in the early days, were run by Lara Greaves and still by Martin von Randau, and more in the later days by Komi Kolandai. So this paper I put on, I wrote this as quickly as I could to sort of get out there in a timely fashion. We run the survey prior to them deciding on what the four flags were that we eventually chose between, but there was like the first referendum of whether you support change or not. Take home here is you cannot find a single demographic that supported change more than did not support change. There's some differences, there's some gradients here, I should say. So those who were in higher incomes were more likely to support change, and those who were in rich areas were more likely to, rich areas at deciles 1 or 2, that's least deprived, more likely to support change. And what I put that down to is people who live in poor areas and don't have much money have a lot more things to worry about than whether or not you change the flag. Building on that, Lara wrote a paper on whether support for referenda generally changed as a result of this. And so we ran this the survey a year after, in which we, in both surveys, the 2014, 2015, 2016, one of the two, 15, 16, we asked whether people supported referenda. And we thought because it was slightly unwanted, very unwanted, the flag referendum. And the 2016 survey also happened, I think, 3 weeks after Brexit hit, where there was a lot of referenda remorse, I think it's fair to say, with Brexit. And so we thought maybe people would be less likely to support referenda. But actually it was, if anything, the opposite. People support increased for referenda. I'd love to talk about going straight home, where there was a survey done of people just before release in prison and just after release, 6 months and 12 months after being released from prison, looking to see whether housing stability impacted reoffending. And it looked like it did, but when you controlled for things, there was no causal effect. And then I won't touch on the Te Ao Marama panel, which we're just working on at the moment. And unfortunately, for all the people who are mentioned in the subsequent slides, I will click past them. Sorry, Maria. Sorry, Jane. But because I want to finish on just the fact that I've been. You've heard that I've been privileged in a number of ways, falling my way into jobs being one of them. But I think another way that I've been privileged that I've only really just cottoned onto in the last, let's say, 5 years, is the value of working in teams. So I've worked in, I'm not even showing growing up and not even showing Dunedin. This is when I worked in the UK at King's College London, and these are 3 photos of campus over time. And it's only occurred to me over the last sort of 5 years what a natural mentoring environment you get from working in a team. And I really feel sorry for others who come into universities and kind of land there. They're very delighted that they got the job, but something has to be invented around them for mentorship, whereas this kind of natural mentorship, I think, that happens with teams. Flip side of that, of course, is it costs a lot of money to keep these teams going. And I've consistently failed to keep people employed in Compass over time because it's just really difficult to keep getting the money coming in to keep people employed. So apologies to all the people who I would like to still be in Compass, but just the money ran out. We didn't have the research money coming in. A big thank you to everyone who I didn't mention otherwise in this talk. And maybe I will just mention a couple of people here because it needs to be mentioned. I think the support people you get at universities who aren't the researchers, but are just crucial in making research happen and making teaching happen, for that matter. So Jerry Cottrell, who was on my interview team when I first joined Compass, moved on now. Gary Patterson has moved on, a finance director in the Faculty of Arts. Compass would not have survived without him. Sabrina Schult, accountant who basically just got shit done, pretty much. And Marilyn Humphrey, who was the facilities coordinator, but also helped a lot with IT and was really supportive of me and other people. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Barry, for a wonderful, wonderful talk and just to hear so much about what you're doing. My name is Francis Collins. I'm the head of School of Social Sciences, which is where Compass is based. And so it's really a nice privilege to be able to just wrap things up here for you this evening. I just want to make 2 points rather than talk through my notes here because there's too many of them. The first one is just to note the breadth of research that you've undertaken, Barry. And I was jotting down as we went in population, health, mortality, class and social mobility, migration, inequality, ethnicity, attitudes, policy, childhood and life course, mental health, family, and a range of other topics that are being covered off in Barry's research. This is extraordinary for anyone undertaking research. And in the social science fields that we work in, it intersects with much of what we do, but very few people bring those intersections together. So I just want to acknowledge that because it's extraordinary to have a career that can bring all of those things together. In the interest of time, I only have one other point I want to make here, and it's around serendipity, because I love that as a thing. Because we often, craft these narratives of being academics, so we all know where we're going and we assemble everything together. And I feel we do that in retrospect. And you've chosen to give us the account that sees you moving from one place to the other through connections with people. Of course, the other side of the social research that we do. But I also want to say that universities are assembled serendipitously, notwithstanding the claims to strategic objectives. Sorry, Simon. and as a result, we are very lucky at Waipapa Taumata Rau and in the School of Social Sciences, Te Puna Marama, to have you, Barry. And that is the serendipity that comes about through the same sorts of connections. And to have you and leading Compass is extraordinary for us. And I think it just is a fundamentally important part of the school and the faculty and the university more widely. So I'm going to ask us all to join just as we wrap up in a second with the Waiata, Te Aroha. But before I do that, I'm just going to offer this small gift that's been prepared for you, and just to thank you again for really wonderful talk this evening. So,
Thank you.
Thank you, Barry.
Thank you, everyone.
You too. Ke tato.
Te aroha, te whakapono, me te mari e tato e.
Ano.
Te aroha, te whakapono, me te rangi